here we are. This is Sex, Love Psychedelics, and I'm your host, Dr. Kat. Bringing you psychosexual conversations that will leave you intellectually turned on and hungry for more.
Yeah. Although I will say, and you brought up the point I want to expand on, you said that you had struggled with suicide ideation before and depression, and wanting everyone to listen on here that, you know, psychedelics can be a tool, but it's not the panacea. It's not for everyone. Yeah. So here's where I think you're in such a unique position to talk about how we can take care of ourselves on the nutritional level, on the supplement level, because this can, you know, psychedelics become face to face with some of these deepest, hardest traumas and depression that does impact, you said, saggy skin, you know, heaviness in the body. So let's talk about this unique aspect, how you paired those two together, how you see it supporting.
How I paired which two things together?
The supplements, the nutrition, your side of the biohacking with the psychedelics.
Yeah. I mean, first off, I was like, okay, are any of these things that I'm exploring in terms of these substances that are illegal, and of course, many of them are moving towards legality, thankfully, at least through kind of clinical channels.
Yeah,
I think is great. I was like, okay, are any of these things possible through what's currently available as dietary supplements? And I would say for the most part, they're not. There are things that I could certainly high dose that could elicit some of the effects of these psychedelics, but it's definitely not possible that I'm seeing. And of course, I think the FDA would step in if they were that experiential on that regard. So then I took the idea of like, okay, if we're in these different substances, what would I do going into the journey experience? What would I do during the journey experience? What would I do post-journey? What would I stack with microdoses? Since I have all this knowledge of all these substances and the way they work and different pathways that they can exploit, like for example, BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the neuroplasticity protein, how would I enhance that? Because you know, not to step on toes with therapy, but like I think a lot of times therapy can be effective from a standpoint of it's good to talk. And certainly men do not talk very well with each other. It's epidemic. When I go to masterminds, it's a beautiful thing to see wounded Puma entrepreneur like men speaking very vulnerably about their problems. It is epidemic with men. I think women are much better at it with each other, at just speaking. But it's obviously important to speak. Certainly if you're lonely, if you don't have those people, if you don't have people you know or trust to speak to someone. But I think as far as eliciting significant change because of default mode network and the ego and these constructs, and because of neuroplasticity, one, not being nearly as high as when you're in psychedelics, but two, when you're depressed, neuroplasticity is dramatically down. You tend to stay in loops. You tend to be very fixed in your thinking. And then again, default mode network is all the way up. The constructs are all the way up. You're holding on to constructs. Between those two things, you're creating stories. There's the idea of like, who would I be without this trauma? Like this trauma is tied to my identity. So all these things are taking place. But like when you're in a psychedelic environment and getting therapy, that's when we've seen incredible data. Like the studies. And let me make that clear too. In that, I don't think just using psychedelics on your own, unless you're highly experienced, is smart either. You can actually be in a situation where you can create more trauma. Children have very elevated BDNF. Children have, you know, an easily impressionable low default mode network scenario. They're hearing, their eyesight, their senses are more sensitive. Everything's turned up. So when we're in psychedelics, it's like you're turned up emotionally, physically, spiritually, and things can just come in and imprint. You're cracking open your operating system and say, like, hey, let's rewrite this thing. And that can certainly work to your favor, but it can work against you.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful in these environments, which is what actually, like, while I'm a champion of these things being legalized, I do worry about them being overly available and then it being like, party stuff and, being combined with alcohol and all these kinds of things. And Kim Kardashian has her own strain of blah, blah, blah. It's like that stuff kind of worries me that won't be taken seriously and
people will get hurt.
Cause more trauma. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the combination of the two, the psychotherapy plus the psychedelics, that's when we're seeing in studies these 50 to 80% cure rates of PTSD, of suicidal ideation, of depression, of anxiety in anywhere from, let's say, 8 weeks to 1 year. We're seeing numbers like that, 50 to 80% cure rates. And I'm saying cure, and I don't use that word lightly, in that they no longer meet the definition for depression. They no longer meet the definition for PTSD.
Right.
That does not happen with SSRIs and all these other things.
Right.
Well, that was fun. Thanks for tuning in, lovers. And if you want to experience more ecstasy and sexual liberation, head over to sexlovepsychedelics.com and learn about how you can join me for any one of my online or live events. And while you're there, grab my free guide on sex and psychedelics. Remember, this podcast is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Please contact your healthcare provider and local law before pursuing any of the products or psychedelics discussed. And one final note here. I make this show specifically for you. If you're loving the show, then be sure to leave me a review in iTunes or Spotify to let me know. Happy to be here and happy to serve. I'll see you next time on Sex, Love, Psychedelics.